Hello everyone, and thank you very much for tuning into another one of my presentations. Today I want to talk a little bit about an independent study course that I've taken this past semester. I was doing the reading for a textbook that I thought was very interesting. I wanted to do a little bit more studies on historical linguistics. So I was doing the readings for Historical Linguistics and Introduction by Lyle Campbell, and along with that I wanted to do an independent study on the structure of Old French. Being fluent in French, I was just interested in the structure of Old French to see some changes that have happened since Old French. So that is going to be the basis of my presentation for today. So just to go a little bit of a presentation overview, I'm going to begin with an introduction. I'm going to briefly explain some notions about prehistory of French, and then I'm going to move into some two key elements that I'll be talking about for the presentation. The first being phonology and the second being morphology. And then I'm going to be looking at vowels and consonants, just giving a little bit of a phonemic inventory of ancient Old French. And then for morphology, just going to be looking basically at the articles, both definite and indefinite. I'm going to be looking at nouns, masculine and feminine, and their various declensions, and looking at pronouns and verbs. And then I'm going to get into a conclusion, contact, and of course references. So basically, the presentation isn't aiming at providing a thorough account of the language. I basically just really want to give a brief overview of some basic information that concerns Old French. So if you were to look at some basic texts of Old French, you'd be able to decipher some key elements and distinguish some of the biggest differences from Old French to modern French, and hopefully that'll become a little bit clearer later on in this presentation. So I'm not really going to do a comparison about Old French and Modern French. I'm basically just going to be just providing some grammar ideas about really how the structure was. So French is spoken in many regions across the world, both as a majority as well as an official language. And French was not a unified language at one point. It was actually composed of various dialects, and I'm going to be discussing very briefly some of these dialects later on. And this presentation isn't going to really look at modern French, nor is it going to look at Middle French, solely Old French. So looking a little bit about the prehistory of French, French is considered a Romance language, and other languages that fall in this category include Italian, Portuguese, and Spanish. And these languages are derived from Latin, but more specifically from Vulgar Latin. And no, I don't mean swear words in Latin, I mean popular Latin, the language that was spoken by the people. And as I said, other languages that are derived from Latin. And then Comrie 2011 on page 171 explains that Vulgar Latin was spoken in the Gaul territory during the Roman Empire, and as the empire crumbled, a number of major dialectal divisions developed which do not necessarily correspond to present-day political or linguistic frontiers. And Ricard 1989 explains about the expansion of the vernacular language throughout the French territory, and in the 13th century the vernacular language was used even up in Picardy. And when we think of French, the very first text that was ever written in what we call Old French was back in 842, and it was called Les Sermons de Strasbourg, and can be translated as the Oaths of Strasbourg. And it's one of the most famous pieces ever produced, and probably one of the longest, and maybe the most famous one is La Chanson de Roland, which is Roland's song. And Ricard 1989 explains that during the 14th and 16th centuries, the language was spoken in the Parisian region became the norm. And there's other indications of really why the Parisian dialect kind of became the norm. There have been some authors who way back in Old French when they've been writing that they would actually apologize for not using the norm because they were not from Paris. They were using kind of an improper dialect. And as I was talking about the expansion of different dialects, there were two main dialects that were spoken in the French territory. That included la langue d'oc as well as la langue d'oil. Okay, so looking now at some local dialects in the French territory, we can see this map that I took from Choron 1999 on page 37. It's a very nice map that illustrates la langue d'oil, as I said, which is in the Northern Territory, and then La Languedoc, that's in the Southern Territory. And then there's some other little dialects that are found there. We can see Breton is off over to the west, and then Franco-Provençal over to the east. So a considerable amount of dialects were spoken in northern France, and some of the dialects include Normandy, Picardy, Wallonia, Champagne, Lorraine, Anjou, Maine, as well as Touraine, and also Anglo-Norman in England. And then Pope 1952 on page 70 explains that the French language that was spoken in the west and northwestern regions of France, including Paris, were speedily modified in the mouths of the English. And then the two dialects, the main dialects, Ak and Doi, both mean yes in their respective dialects. So now looking a little bit about phonology, just a quick overview of phonology. Right here I just presented some oral vowels, so really the one main difference is there's oral vowels in Old French. There's also oral diphthongs that don't exist now in French. There are no diphthongs. Nasal diphthongs. There are no nasal diphthongs in modern French, as well as triphthongs. There are no triphthongs in French. So for the first one, when we look at the triphthongs, EAU, it would be pronounced EAU, and that's the French word for water. But now it's simply EAU is simply pronounced O and no longer the triphthong of EAU. So just looking basically at the oral vowels, you can see there really isn't many differences with the different vowels, but one striking remark is actually there's no closed O in Old French, but there is a closed O in modern French, and there's a few sounds that exist in modern French that didn't exist in Old French, and those include the and e. And if we look at the consonants, there is some disagreement in terms of the consonants that were used in Old French. Some literature included some consonants, and some authors didn't include others. So Hal Jr. 1949 includes the dentals, but other people didn't include the dentals of the and the in words. And there were some affricates also that were found in Old French, and that included ts, and that included j. And then another interesting thing is dealing with penultimate vowels, and usually penultimate vowels were omitted in Old French when we were dealing with Latin. So an example could be tabula was reduced to table, which means table in French. And if we look a little bit now at the morphology of Old French, Latin consisted of three genders, masculine, feminine, and neuter, and only two genders actually exist in Old French, just like in modern French, the masculine and feminine. However, as I said, there were three genders that existed in Latin that included the neuter, but the neuter did exist in only a few rare extreme cases in Old French. And the Latin was rich in cases, and Old French actually retained two of these cases. They retained the nominative and the oblique. And so I'm going to illustrate a little bit of the difference with the different cases with these articles. So articles are found in the following table, and there were many variants depending on the region, and also prepositions amalgamated quite frequently with articles. Even in modern French, articles can amalgamate with prepositions, but it definitely did so way more in Old French. But there were some amalgamations that are still retained in extreme rare circumstances in modern French. An example is the en, les, meaning in, the, is actually contracted into s, and there's a few exceptions or a few instances when we use the s, and it's basically dealing with degrees. We can say un bac ès arts, meaning a Bachelor of Arts, a Bachelor in the Arts. So if we just quickly look at the definite articles, we can see for masculine, for the subject case, it's actually just li for singular, le for plural. Oblique case, we have li and then les. So we have in the plural, it kind of looks quite similar to what we use now in modern French. And then for the feminine, we have la and les, which is identical to what modern French uses. Yeah, and there's a little bit of discrepancy with the literature. So Joly 2009 uses li for the oblique case, but Anglade 2008 uses lo and le for the oblique case. Now just looking briefly at some nouns, masculine and feminine. There are three different groups of nouns that belong to the first, second, or third groups, or declensions, and for either masculine or feminine nouns. So if we look at the first declension for masculine nouns, we can see that there's an S that's added for the nominative singular, and that is taken off for the oblique singular. And if we look at the plural nominative, there is no S, but the oblique case has the S. So actually in modern French, it uses kind of the structure of oblique, where singular doesn't have an S, plural does have an S. If we look at masculine for the second declension, we have père, which there are no variations, it's simply P-E-R-E. If we look at feminine, we have la fille and les filles, which is very similar to what we have in modern French now. It's identical. And if we have the second declension, we have la fleur with an S, la fleur with for the oblique singular, and they have les fleurs for plural, which is quite similar to modern French, but it's no longer a closed O, it's actually the E, les fleurs. And then this is the most interesting one. It's the third declension. It actually shows where there is some variation with the root of the noun. So if we look at the English equivalent, we'll just look at boy, the second one. So the nominative singular, we have les garçons. So the Z is pronounced as a T, an affricate. And then oblique, we have le garçon. And then for plural, we have le garçon, and then les garçons. And then if we look at the feminine declension, for the third declension, we have la pute for singular and la putain for the oblique. Unfortunately, it's not the best of words to be using, but it's actually one of the best examples to show this. And so pute and putain means prostitute. Okay, so looking quickly at pronouns now, we can see that there's actually quite variation with the pronouns, especially with the first person singular in the nominative case. We can get jie, jo, jou, ju, jeo, depending on really the variety and where it's spoken. There's not that many differences for the second person singular with chu and te. For the nominative, there's a little bit of variation for the third person masculine, feminine, and neuter that shows up, and not very much differentiation for first person and second person plural with nos or nous, vos, and vous. And if we look at the oblique case now, we can see that there's quite a bit of variation. Me, mei, moi, me for the first person singular. And it's actually interesting, the pronouns actually come from Latin based, except for the third person, they actually come from demonstratives in Latin. So first person, second person, plural, and singular come from pronouns, but third person actually comes from demonstratives in Latin. And so I've taken these pronouns from Renom de l'Age 2010, pages 71 to 72. So just looking a little bit now at some infinitives, Renom de l'Age 2010 explains the different types of infinitives. So there's actually 4 different types of infinitives. They include ER or IER, and the variant IER is used for the root that ends in a palatal sound, so it changes from aider for help to help, and changer to change, and repérer to repair. And then IR is used for examples with partir to leave, ouïr to listen, and offrir to offer. And then verbs ending in EIR, OIR with avoir to have, and manoir to inhabit. And then verbs belonging to the strong type portray changes in the root of the verb in their conjugations and include such endings as RE with dire to say, and faire to do. So if we look at quickly present tense for verbs, there isn't really that much difference with modern French conjugation. So for first person singular, we have E, second person, we have ES, third person, we have E, sometimes T, and then for plural, ONS, IEZ, or IES, as well as ENT for third person. And if we look at the second conjugation for finir, we have is, is, sometimes t for the third person, and then we have the root changes a little bit to finis, and then ons, iez, and then also variants of ez, ies, or es, and then third person is ent. And source of this is Renan de Lage 2010, pages 117 to 118. And then an example of a third conjugation is with ouvrir and the diphthongization of the O, which becomes O. Okay, so that was just a very quick overview of just the present tense. I didn't want to go into all of the different moods and tenses that exist in Old French because there's just as many as there are in modern French. So in conclusion, Old French does share similarities with Latin, but the language has steered clear of its Latin roots fairly quickly, providing some striking differences. Morphology is still complex but has simplified from its Latin roots. The first piece of literature in French dates back way back to 842 with Les Sermons de Strasbourg, and then the second most famous one is La Chanson de Roland in 1080. And since then the language has evolved drastically and there is no longer the two cases in modern French. And then the conjugations, as I showed for the present tense, are not that different as modern French. And who knows what further changes will be in store for the French language. So I thank you very much for listening to my presentation. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email me. My email address is right there. And if you're interested in just looking at some of the literature that I looked at for this project, I'm just providing some of the references right here. So once again, thank you very much for watching, and have a good day.